El Nino arrives with heavy rain and flash floods. Conditions are truly miserable for the homeless, especially for those living on the streets of Tijuana. Jerry Sanders and the city of San Diego took pride in reforming city workers' pensions, but a state board says not so fast. And SeaWorld settles with the state over citations involving killer whales and their trainers and files a lawsuit. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are KPBS Fronteras reporter Jean Guerrero. Hi, Jean.
Hi, Mark. It's
good to see you back again. Reporter Liam Dillon, a voice of San Diego. Hi, Liam.
Hi, Mark.
Happy New Year to everybody. And Lori Weisberg, who covers tourism and marketing for the San Diego Union Tribune. Hi, Lori.
Hi there.
Glad you're here. Well, the long-awaited El Nino made a furious ride through San Diego and in Southern California this week, delivering flash floods, high winds, lightning, even a few tornadoes. The misery was acute for homeless people, and that's especially true south of the border. Now, Jean, you visited a Tijuana shelter there, a migrant shelter. Set the scene for us. What was it like down there?
Right, so I went to the Salesiano, which is one of the largest migrant shelters in Tijuana. They serve more than 1,000 visitors breakfast every day. So earlier this week, as these visitors were heading out the door, most of them homeless migrants, they received a thick wool blanket to help them keep warm in the cold, rainy weather. So they handed out more than 1,000 of these blankets, and these migrants were talking about how they were going to wrap themselves up inside of the blankets, inside of a trash bag, to keep dry in the rain.
Well, you know, it's horrible in San Diego for the homeless. We've done stories this week, and a lot of outlets have done stories this week on that. But in Tijuana, they don't have the infrastructure we have here. They don't have, a lot of the pumping situations and shelters. I mean, it just seems like the misery index gets worse when we go south of the border.
Right, it does seem that way. Actually, in Tijuana, the word migrante, migrant, is essentially synonymous with indigente for homeless. So most of the homeless people in Tijuana are people who lived in the United States and were deported, and they're just living out on the streets, waiting for another chance to cross the border because many of them have spouses and children in the United States. The problem for them is that they, in many cases, don't have Mexican identification papers, so they can't get jobs. In many cases, they complain of discrimination by police when they can't present any kind of document to show who they are, and complain of being placed in jail. So often they're forced to join the informal economy, wiping windshields at intersections, collecting cans for recycling. So they have a really hard time.
Now, weren't some of these migrants living in the Tijuana River Canal at one point?
Yeah, there were more than 1,000 of these homeless migrants living in the Tijuana River Canal in this homeless encampment called El Bordo, which is that's basically Spanglish for the border because it's right next to the United States, and it was very visible. But just last March, because of heavy rains, the mayor decided to evacuate the canal and send most of these people to drug rehabilitation centers. Many of them were using heroin and methamphetamine. Some weren't, but they were sent anyway. Officials said that they wanted them basically out of public sight because they were hurting tourism and border business. But many of these people are back on the streets. This week they were just trying to take cover underneath bridges because of the rain.
And what about past El Ninos? It's really been bad when some of these big storms have come through in the past for some of the things we're describing.
That's true. In the 1990s, there were some really heavy rains in Tijuana, and basically thousands of people were left homeless, destroyed so many houses. Dozens of people lost their lives because of the rain. What's interesting is that the worst year for Tijuana was 1993, which was not an El Nino year, but in 1997, which was, houses were destroyed, cars were swept up in currents, and it gets pretty apocalyptic in Tijuana during the heavy rains because they have so many steep hills and these makeshift neighborhoods that...
And the worst may be yet to come, Lori.
Well, yeah, and it isn't a big problem that you just put out the makeshift homes, poorly constructed.
lots of debris that
lack of building codes,
and lots of debris that continues to pile up and then clogs the drains. So I know you wrote about that they tried to do some preparation in terms of preparing people for this, but if that continues to be a problem, these poorly constructed homes and the debris, is there really that much they can do from year to year to stave off these conditions when it does flood?
Well, I mean, they have, like you mentioned, they made a lot of, they started preparing for this really early, and so far this week, it seems that these preparations have had a benefit for these communities.
We didn't have reports of deaths this week.
No, only about 5 families were evacuated from their homes because Tijuana started preparing by cleaning out water infrastructure as early as August. So they have these settling tanks that were built after the 1990s El Nino rains to try to avoid the disasters that we saw that decade. They basically capture debris and trash and allow the water to flow while decreasing the risk of flood. And so they cleaned all these out repeatedly since August, as well as the canals.
And it kind of paid off this week to that regard because the water moved through and we didn't hear those disaster things. Now, doesn't some of the flooding in these areas affect that Tijuana River Valley on the U.S. side of the border and that whole area too?
Right, exactly. So part of the problem in Tijuana is that there's about 30 very steep canyons where you have these makeshift neighborhoods of foundations of car tires made with wooden planks, like you were mentioning, and tin roofs. And one of the biggest ones is called Los Laureles, right across from the U.S.-Mexico border. So when it rains heavily, you'll see pieces of houses and all of the trash because of the lack of infrastructure, garbage collection services, etc. It all gets into the Tijuana River Valley in the United States because of the lower elevation in the United States side of the Tijuana River Valley.
Just the natural flow.
Exactly. And so then you've got floods in Imperial Beach and clogged horse trails, and then U.S. Border Patrol has challenges there as well.
And there were stories in San Diego this week of people monitoring that, the safety officials and others watching that area, but again, kind of came through it okay there too. Right?
Yeah, it's been, U.S. Border Patrol was mentioning to me that sometimes they have to make rescues of Mexican people who get caught in the currents that pour into the United States because of these elevations that I was talking about, and they haven't reported any rescues.
So what do we think about next week? What are they looking for in Tijuana next week?
Well, we're supposed to have a dry period, but there's no telling what can happen if the rains hit once again at the intensity that we had.
And again, we're just in early January, and of course we've been doing the stories and seeing them. I mean, this could run right on through March and maybe even into April.
Right, that's true.
We'll be watching that situation, I'm sure, as we move forward in the year. Well, San Diego's battered labor movement got some rare good news this week. The state board that oversees dealings with public employees took aim at Prop B, the 2012 proposition that ended pension benefits for new city employees. Prop B remains, but its main provisions were reversed. Michael Zuchet, general manager of the Municipal Employees Union, believes the board's decision was correct.
Consistent with the proceedings that happened at PERB, where the mayor and the mayor's chief of staff and the mayor's deputy chief of staff and his communications director all testified that essentially Prop B came from the mayor's office and was initiated and drafted and supported with the mayor and his public staff and taxpayer money and taxpayer resources. And the significance of all that is that because it was done in the mayor's office, the mayor had an obligation to meet and confer with city unions before deciding to proceed.
All right, Liam, take us through this. What did the state ruling mean, and what effect did it have?
Right. So this is unfortunately, I think most of us thought the pension wars were over, but I guess we have a renaissance or so, as you will. So back in 2012, this was supposed to be the stake in the heart of everything to do with pensions. It was an initiative that was brought forward by Mayor Jerry Sanders, then City Councilman Carl DeMaio, and then City Councilman and current Mayor Kevin Faulconer were the main proponents of it. What they wanted to do was end pensions for new hires primarily, except for police officers. And so what the labor unions argued is, hey, listen, if you're the mayor, the labor laws in the state of California say you have to negotiate with us before you make changes to pensions, whether they're for current employees or for future ones. And so they complained after the ballot measure passed, and throughout the process, that was something they needed to do. And then finally, the end of last year, we got a ruling from this state labor board saying, yeah, you're right. They needed to negotiate. And so we're probably at the point now where the city council is going to discuss this next week, whether they want to appeal to an appellate court to see whether they want to throw this thing out or see what happens from there. But it's a huge screw up by a lot of different people, and one that's causing a lot of problems right now.
And one of the keys was former Mayor Sanders. He badly wanted his name on this.
Sure.
But then he portrayed himself as a private citizen. It wasn't the weight of the mayor and the political
right. There was
there.
A lot of parsing. I'm not the mayor today. I'm this private citizen named Jerry today, and so that was sort of the argument that they were using. And yeah, you're right. I mean, this is a bit of an unforced error. If the mayor's name was not on it, or the mayor's people and his staff were not involved, if, say, Faulkner or DeMaio took the lead, then this seems, by my reading of the PERB decision, would have been okay. And so because the mayor was so intricately involved, and because there was a lot of evidence that there were staff resources that were used, public staff resources that were used, that's why we have the problem today.
And this Prop B passed pretty easily, right?
Passed overwhelmingly.
Yeah, because you're a city coming through financial woes,
Sure.
and it's, my goodness. And we should point out, a lot of stories don't, in context, that city employees don't get Social Security. This pension here was kind of critical to the retirement of long-term city employees.
Sure, but again, I think it's also important to point out that the way that the benefits are structured now, people are not getting any less money through 401ks that the city now offers than they were over.
Lori?
So you say that council is going to consider whether to appeal. I thought I read that both the mayor and then the city attorney, want to appeal, and I thought the city attorney said, this is a pro-labor board, not to worry, we'll appeal, this will all go away. Is he being overconfident, or is this still quite the mess?
Sure. Well, I think it is a mess, and I think, again, the point is that this didn't have to happen. Like, the only reason this is a problem is because the mayor was so involved in this getting started in the first place, and so it's a problem that didn't need to be there. As far as whether what appellate court's going to say, I don't know. I mean, I think there are some legitimate arguments that, on First Amendment issues, it's so what if he's the mayor? He's just a person, he's a citizen of California, he's a citizen of San Diego, who should be able to say and do what he wants on ballot measures. And so that's the counter argument. And so the labor law says one thing, the Constitution says another, and so we'll see where this situation.
That's a nice segue. We do have a 6th District City Councilman Chris Cate was talking to KPBS this week on that very issue. Let's hear what he had to say.
Well, I think that's the argument, is whether or not we as elected officials have First Amendment rights and what we want to support or oppose when it comes to measures that are on the ballot. Nothing about this was a city council decision to place the measure on the ballot. This was done through the initiative process. The only option that the council had after we had collected the required number of signatures was to place this measure on the ballot, as is with any referendum process.
All right. Is he telling the whole story there from the labor's point of view?
No. I mean, he's leaving out the fact that if the mayor, it's different than just an elected official. Again, the mayor under the city laws is the chief labor negotiator. That's why he's the one who has all of these responsibilities. And so he's leaving that part out a bit, again, pointing to the fact that this didn't have to happen, an unforced error, right? But yeah, I mean, he can say what he wants, and we'll see where again, this falls in.
Well, let's get into the weeds a little bit on this. How many city employees were hired without pensions since this went into effect?
Yeah, great question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head.
I happen to have it right here.
There you go. You told me, right?
It was, and this again comes from Zucat, from the labor side. That is the source on that, and he said around 2,000. So that's quite a few folks here. So, and again,
about 20% of the labor force.
Okay, so the next question gets to be, what has to happen here if this ruling stands? So you have to pay back pension contributions. The employees themselves have to pay contributions. There's 7% interest that would be applied to the city side of this. It seems like a real mess.
Right. So what the labor board said the city had to do was to make everybody whole, which means basically, my reading again was giving them pensions, and giving them pensions on top of the 401ks that they already have. And there's so many different complications here. It seems to me that what they ordered to do would never actually happen. It's more likely, if this thing stands, that they'll all get in a room, the city, the labor unions will say, hey, how can we work this out to everybody's satisfaction? It's going to be a big payout, whether it's in the 1 million, 10 million, 100 million, I don't know. But that's sort of whatever leverage anyone ends up having at the end of the day is going to determine what that number is going to be.
Well, and then as far as the city goes regarding leverage, it gets back to what you were saying a while ago, which you could go back to court, to the appeals court, and lose there.
That's right. And then another thing the labor board said is the city now is responsible for paying all the legal fees. And so we're, at the very least, we're going to have a big legal bill.
All right. And what about the city attorney, Jan Goldsmith? Has he reacted to this? What's his position now?
His position is he's going to present it for an appeal, and he's said in the past that he doesn't think that this labor board really matters. And so we'll see whether the appellate court will decide that.
Do you think the folks on the city council will go for an appeal at this point, or maybe just sit down and start negotiating?
No, I think that they will. I think you can certainly count on the 4 Republicans in the council to do so, and then you only have to pick off one Democrat, I think. But I think there have been many indications. There are a number of Democrats who have supported Kevin Faulconer in the past, Myrtle Cole and Sherry Leitner, and Leitner herself was a supporter of the measure. And so it's tough for me to see that this is not ultimately going to be.
They wouldn't do that. Now let's talk about former Councilman Carl DeMaio. He kind of used this as a unsuccessful attempt to springboard to higher office. First the mayor, then he ran for Congress, and he was Mr. Pension Reform. Does this kind of tarnish his legacy a bit?
I mean, I don't think so, in the sense that, by my reading of this ruling, he personally didn't do anything wrong. If you're going to blame someone for this, then you blame the former Mayor Sanders.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll see how that all plays. Now, the city treasury going forward, as we say, we don't know how much money is involved, but just when things seem like we're getting back on our feet, we're going to put some money into the battered infrastructure and some of these desperate needs here. This could really hit the city treasury.
Sure. And again, this is all very dumb. I mean, this is very dumb because no one said that the city can't do what they ultimately ended up doing. It's this technicality that was unforced that the former mayor did because he wanted, there was an email from the former mayor's spokesman where he reached out to Bill O'Reilly on city email and saying, hey, my mayor wants to talk to you about what he's doing on the war on pensions. And so this is something he didn't need to do, didn't need to happen, but it did, and now we're in the problem that we're in now.
That couldn't I think you kind of referenced it, but couldn't the 401k payments, both by the employees and the city, couldn't that act as mitigation for this, and then you're just done with it?
Sure, but what the PERB said, the labor board said, is that you can't count that or can't consider that as part of the deal. And so this would be in addition to what they were already receiving. It's not necessarily that they got this money, it's they have to go back to what they were getting before, irrespective of what benefit was offered in place of that.
All right. Well, there's no doubt we'll be doing follow-ups and exploring this as it all plays out. A very interesting story. Well, let's move on. SeaWorld can't seem to stay out of the news these days, and it's not the kind of publicity that a major tourist attraction wants. This time, the aquatic theme park has reached an agreement with state regulators over safety issues involving trainers and killer whales. Lori, start with why the state issued these citations in the first place.
They felt that the SeaWorld didn't have enough protections in place to avoid near misses, problems where the trainers were put in jeopardy. They could be hurt by the killer whales. They were too close. They argued they were riding on top of the killer whales, swimming under them, maybe too close to the blowhole. So they felt that these citations were necessary to force better safety procedures.
All right, and a lot of this was prompted by the death of a SeaWorld trainer at its Orlando park there in Florida, not here. What happened then?
So going back to that 2010 drowning death, the federal OSHA came down on SeaWorld and issued citations. And SeaWorld didn't have the kind of success they did at the state level. They fought for 4 years those citations and went through appeals. They finally dropped it because the OSHA was not going to drop those citations. In this case, in exchange for getting what Cal OSHA, the state regulators, thought were stricter policies for providing safety for the trainers, they dropped the citations. Right. So SeaWorld gets to kind of clear its name from, they don't have the citations anymore, but they do have to be very careful, and Cal OSHA will come to unannounced visits over the next 2 years and see if they really are complying with these new safety features. All
right, and what are these specific restrictions? What won't the trainers be able to do that they couldn't in the past?
Well, it mostly has to do with the medical pool, where there is much more interaction. In the show pool, the trainers have been out of the water with the killer whale since the death of that trainer. So it's more this medical pool where they are in more close proximity. It said things like they can't surf on the they use the term they can't surf on the whales. They can't.
Which used to be part of the show. Right?
Yeah. And that was just the medical pool. And then you can't swim under them. It says how far they can be from the water's edge when they're on these slide outs during the shows. So it's those kind of specifics.
So as far as the shows themselves, will park visitors notice much change as a result of these new rules?
No, the only thing that really applies in this case are these slide outs, and it isn't really prescribed how close or how far you can be from the whale itself, but how close you can be from the water's edge, well, presumably where the killer whale is. So no, you're not going to notice much change. That ship has sailed where they were cavorting with the whales in the water. That doesn't happen anymore.
All right, and you mentioned they can come in and kind of unannounced and see what's going on. It would seem you could monitor this any time that a regulator just buys a ticket and goes in and watches at least the public side of it, right?
Yeah, but what they really are trying to monitor is behind the scenes that you and I would never see, and that was where I think they had the biggest issue in these smaller medical pools, where I think they thought they were too close to the animals or not being safe enough.
Is that where most of the accidents were taking place?
Well, clearly the one in the 2010, that was during a performance. So I don't know in terms of if you looked at all the kind of near misses and you tabulated it versus, show pool versus medical pool, I don't know, but they're much in closer quarters and they had more, I think Cal OSHA felt they had much more leeway in being close to the animals than they are, because they aren't anymore in the show pool.
All right, well, SeaWorld scored a victory last month when a federal judge dismissed a lawsuit regarding treatment of the whales. What happened there? That was
people who were visitors to the Orlando, San Antonio, and San Diego parks trying to get a class action lawsuit saying SeaWorld misled them on the treatment of the whales, and therefore you owe us all the money back for us paying admission to come into the park. The court said, no, you haven't proved your case. You haven't shown how you were misled. You knew
what was going on.
You knew what was going on. You really did.
Yeah.
And so they dismissed that. And there's one other potential class action pending that's still out there. But with this ruling, it looks likely that could well be dismissed as well.
Okay. Now, all this comes against this backdrop of negative publicity for SeaWorld after the Coastal Commission ordered to stop that whale breeding program. So over the holidays, SeaWorld stepped up and they filed a suit to challenge that ruling. They're not going to go quietly on that one. What's the situation with that now?
Right. So they want to, they went before the Coastal Commission to get approval to double the volume of their killer whale enclosures.
Yeah, they're going to do this big expansion, much bigger pools. Yeah.
And the Coastal Commission said, yeah, go ahead. But you know what? As a condition, you're going to have to stop breeding the whales. And they thought that set a precedent. They weren't going to stand for it. They said the Coastal Commission had no grounds to tell them how to regulate their orcas. There are federal laws doing that. And they filed suit, I think, mostly to prove a point and get rid of what they thought was something that was precedent setting. The irony is, for now, they've put that project on hold.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a minute. Liam, go ahead.
So why are they trying to prove a point when it seems to me the less the people talk about this, the better it is for them?
I know, and you could argue that both ways. That's true. Why are you stirring up more controversy when you don't need to? On the other hand, I think they're worried that future visits to the Coastal Commission for whatever project they do, the Coastal Commission is going to intrude. They think that maybe that will be more ammunition for others to legislate against them in terms of they need those orcas to be bred to have those that population there to continue, whether it's what other kind of attraction involving the whale. So they want to show that they can't regulate them, and they're worried that does set a bad precedent. But on the other hand, it does stir up continued controversy, and I think there are some who argue, though, that they probably have a pretty good case.
Well, what does this say about this park and their whole kind of business model on this kind of attraction? Are we seeing kind of the end of these kinds of shows and this attraction and the whole killer whale and the element of danger? Let's be honest here.
At least in San Diego.
Yeah, and going to something else, some new model in some other way.
Yeah, the CEO late last year, in an Investors Day meeting, forecast that. He said that they're going to phase out the current killer whale show, and starting in 2017, there'll be something involving the whales, but it'll be emphasize their natural behaviors. They did talk about
more educational.
They talked about siphoning off. This was a $100 million project to expand the tanks. They talked about siphoning off some of that $100 million for a new attraction at SeaWorld, and maybe one that will get more visitors there.
Well, that circles us back around, because they had this whole expansion thing, this whole big new resort, but you alluded to that. It's kind of on hold right now.
Right. So they want to, and they already have. They're in the midst of doing a big new roller coaster at the Orlando park.
Yeah, I saw on the news today they topped that out,
Right.
biggest in Florida, which I guess is saying so. That's a big roller coaster in all the
Now,
parks
granted,
there.
it's very competitive in Florida with Universal and Disney World, but they, I think they're looking at a kind of. They haven't said what this new attraction would be, but I'm sure they're looking at something, a real crowd pleaser, one that just draws a little less attention to the killer whales.
Some sort of amusement ride, or
It could be.
Disney-type
Nobody's
experience?
really talking about what it will be.
Liam, you got an idea for him?
No, I think it's important. I think it's important for all of us when we have these conversations to keep in mind that the city of San Diego is very much invested in SeaWorld's success. I mean, their lease with the
Good
city
point. Yeah.
involves us getting a certain percentage of their revenues as far as rent goes, and so SeaWorld's health is directly tied to how well we're doing as a city.
That's very true.
All right, last question here, and this may be moot based on what we were talking about, but there was another environmental lawsuit coming because of the impact of Mission Bay there. But if they're not going to do this big expansion, that might be moot at this point, right?
It could be, and I don't know if that lawsuit, because it's talking about the SeaWorld, the tank enclosure, if the issues they raised about toxins could apply to other projects that SeaWorld brings forward. So maybe they are setting the groundwork for not just this project that for now is stalled, but other projects.
All right, good time to be a lawyer for SeaWorld, I guess. All right, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Jean Guerrero of KPBS News, Liam Dillon of Voice of San Diego, and Lori Weisberg of the San Diego Union Tribune. A reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.